Thank you for joining us. You're listening to the Write Project podcast and radio program. This is a show about writing and modern Newfoundland author culture. This program is produced and recorded at CHMR FM 93.5 FM in St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador, and is aired on other great stations in the province and elsewhere in the country. It can also be heard online at www.chmr.ca. I'm your host, Matthew LeDrew, author of the Infinity series and founder of Engine Books. Let's see what we have today. Well, thank you for joining us for another wonderful episode of the Write Project podcast. I know that I say they are all wonderful, but this one really is. We are on the line with Claire Wilkshine, the wonderful, wonderful author of The Love Olympics, recently released from Breakwater Books. Thank you for joining us, Claire.
Thank you very much for having me, Matt.
Excellent. I loved your reading at the event down at Bannerman Brewery. It was simply wonderful, and I picked up a copy of the book afterwards and before the event left. I haven't started it yet, but it's a lovely, lovely book, and I recommend it to everyone that I can think of that would like it. There. Tell me a bit about it. Pretend I have no experience with it yet because I haven't finished it yet and stuff like that. Tell me about the Love Olympics as though I'm a 5-year-old, because I am.
Well, thank you very much for saying that. That was a really nice event at Bannerman. I hope that was the first in what I think they are hoping to make a series of book fairs.
I hope so.
Yeah, it was beautiful. Really nice to see all the local publishers there and people coming and just being interested in books and writing and what Writers Newfoundland is putting out and what they're doing. And so that was very nice. In terms of my book, yes, it came out in early October. The Love Olympics is a collection of stories that are interconnected, and they're interconnected in several ways. So one way is that the characters are kind of interlocking. So someone who is the child of somebody in one story, the child who is probably quite a minor character, might pop up as the main character in another story, several stories down the road. And it's very St. John's in that sense. These stories are set in St. John's, and I mean, I certainly often have the sense that, you go to a store and you may well be being served by, in fact, you are being served by the son of your friend whom you didn't know actually worked there. And another thing that's interesting about those interconnections is that a lot of the time they happen and you don't even know, because you never ask who the person is who's behind the counter or who's, I don't know, cutting your hair or whatever. So we have this real web here, I think maybe more than other places. I think the interconnections are maybe greater than in other provinces. And I tried to reflect that in the book.
Yeah, I was getting that when I was reading it. I was going to ask about that. That's interesting. It reminds me of a lot of some short films I've seen. I don't want to use the word art house, but art houses where it's like showing that kind of interconnectivity of people. I was watching one. I can't remember the name of it, but it's very much like that, where it's like individual short stories that take place in a small town that are all linked together, like 5-minute short films that were filmed, and they form a larger movie kind of thing. It's really fun. Right. It's really interesting, and it is the type of thing that you can only do in some places. Like in Canada, I would say Newfoundland's one of the only spots that you can kind of showcase that kind of interconnectivity.
It might be a bit less plausible in Toronto.
It'd be more of a coincidence in Toronto, whereas here it's just the way it happens. Yeah, for sure.
Sorry.
No, go ahead. You go.
Well, you mentioned the films. I was actually thinking about Bernice Morgan's The Topography of Love when I started writing this book because that is another linked collection, not to compare this to Bernice's very fine work, but I think the idea is is similar in some ways. And I think the interconnected stories are kind of having a moment, which I hadn't really realized when I started to write this, because I wasn't really setting out to write a book. I was just setting out to write a story. And then I wrote another story, and it was a lot longer. And then I thought, wow, if I put these together, I've got, a percentage of a book. So I kept on going. But there was no original plan to do that. And then I read Olive Kitteridge, which is fantastic, by Elizabeth Strout, the American author, and started reading and seeing other books with those same kinds of interconnections. So yeah, I think maybe it's a wave. I
Yeah.
had no idea.
That'd be interesting. That'd be interesting. I actually think it compares quite favorably to Bernice Morgan's book. There, I think neither is better, but I think it makes a good companion to that book, actually.
Well, thank you.
Where did you find the title "The Love Olympics"? Is that the title of one of the things? But like it's like I was ended up looking for like more of a connection through the stories that I have read so far, and like looking for not just a connection of familiarity or family or something like that, but like love connections that weave each story together. But I'm not sure if that's it. I'm not sure if it's just the title of one of the short stories, because oftentimes books of short stories are named after one of those titles within it. You know what I mean?
Right.
Where'd the title come from for you?
It is the title of the last story in the book.
Makes sense.
And for me, love is certainly the unifying theme. There are all kinds of different forms of love. The stories they're all about love. They're about love of mothers and children, and friends, long friendships, just the love for a spouse or of someone else's spouse, or all kinds of different manifestations of love. And one day in the car, I guess I was driving along, and I had not yet written that story, The Love Olympics. I was driving along the Marchant Road thinking, I'm going to have a title. What are the stories about? They're really all about love. And I was trying to think about what that is like. And it did occur to me that it was sort of like that, that enduring love is kind of, it's work, and you kind of, to sustain those kinds of relationships, you have to kind of put in the effort, and sometimes there are things that flare up, or there's a kind of slow burn, or so it did occur to me that the Olympics was not an inappropriate metaphor. And then I thought, well, I really like that idea, the Love Olympics, but there is no story called The Love Olympics in the book. So now I'm going to have to write one without having any idea what that might look like. So I just sat down and wrote a story called The Love Olympics, and it seemed like the right way to close the book.
And I like it. I like it. When I first heard the title, I am a giant nerd, as people often either lovingly or ruefully say to me. When I first heard the title, I thought it was a dystopian novel. I thought it was like some kind of like the Running Man situation where people had to like compete on a reality TV show to prove like that they were the best at love or the most worthy of love or something like that. Like
that sounds horrendous.
It does. It does. It does. Most dystopian concepts do. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a lovely book. Your prose is very touching. You have a real, obviously, but like you have a real gift for prose and making each sentence something that like I just kind of sit and ponder over for a minute. It's not a book that I can stop and just read the entire thing very quickly. I have to stop and like, oh, that's interesting. Let's think, kind of thing. Which is interesting. It's its own kind of enjoyment where I have a ponder, you know what I mean, after a particularly good paragraph or sentence or something like that. It's an interesting like exploration of the art form in some ways.
Thank you very much for saying that. I think you've hit on something that's very important to me. My interest in writing is mostly writing at the level of the sentence. I really like individual sentences, and I want them to do certain kinds of things. And so I do spend a lot of time tinkering with sentence. I mean, obviously that's what you do when you write, but I'm really kind of focused on the macro level in that sense, or is that the micro level? I always get those mixed up. The
I think that's
small,
micro. Yeah.
small
Yeah.
bit, you know. It's interesting that you would say that, and thank you very much. And in fact, I am really interested in writing at the level of the sentence. Obviously, as writers, what we do is work on our sentences because you don't have books without sentences in them. But I am particularly focused on, I like long sentences and then sometimes short ones. I like to really fool around with the detail of the sentence until I feel that it does what I want it to do. And that's the part of writing that brings me enjoyment. And it's what I like in other people's writing. So actually, there's the longest story in this book is called The Dinner. And when I was writing that, I was thinking about Margaret Drabble's The Radiant Way, which came out in the 80s. And I particularly like that book. And I have enormous admiration for Drabble's beautiful, very long, beautifully balanced, carefully structured sentences. And I wanted in that story, which is about a friendship, the friendship of three women and their enduring friendship over time and through all the various things that have happened to them. I wanted to do kind of my own version of that. So my story also has long sentences, and it's also about the enduring friendship of three women, only they're not in London, they're in St. John's. And of course, there are many other differences, including the fact that I'm not Margaret Drabble. But I do really admire that kind of attention to detail in the specific words and the punctuation. And I'm sure I'm a nightmare for editors because I'm very fussy about where the commas go, because that kind of thing.
Yep. That's interesting. That's a side of the craft that I appreciate, but I'm not familiar with myself. I'm more of on a scene level, but on that level, I've learned to kind of tune in, and I'm learning how, as I read more writers who are interested the micro level, how to read it. I find that sometimes like a certain type of reader can't appreciate it, and I can understand why they can't, because it's a different side of the form. You know what I mean? Like it is different. You can't read through it. You can't like speed through it and just let the movie play in your head like you can with some forms. You actually have to stop and consider the sentence and consider the way it's created. Your work was very much like that. Heather Nolan's work, This Is Agatha Falling, was from Peddler, was a lot like that. Also from Peddler, Craig Francis Power's book, Hope, was a lot like that. A lot of those like you have to pay attention to each sentence kind of thing, which is just incredible. Like I can't conceive of it. It's interesting to talk to writers who do this, because usually there's like, oh, we could like kind of joke about the craft, but it's a level of it that I feel like I can't even converse with in some ways, because it's like I'm very macro level, the big picture. Like, okay, first things first, let's look at the work as a whole, and then let's zoom in and look at each chapter, and then let's look at each scene. But I rarely go deeper than scene level and go to each individual sentence. It's more like, does this sentence work with the scene it's in? Is the scene accomplishing the thing? And there's a lot of accomplishment in as in like focus on accomplishment in that kind of work. Like when it's a detective novel, like each scene has to accomplish something. It has to move the narrative forward. It has to, that kind of thing. How do you do that? How do you focus? I cannot imagine. How do you focus on individual sentences like that and go in? I feel like my eyes would bleed.
Well, I'm not very good at the big picture thing. I really respect people who are. I'm thinking of J.K. Rowling, for example. I really like the Harry Potter books, and the level of structure the intricacy of the structure that and the planning that she did to make it so that someone walks out of the room in book 7 and you realize that they're doing something that's related to a minor incident in book 2. And I mean, it's absolutely, is there a book 7? I'm not sure. Is it 6 books?
Yep.
I can't remember. Anyway, I find that beautiful and remarkable. I mean, she is really the kind of plotter par excellence. Even people who are really good at plot don't usually achieve quite that level of intricacy. But I think that's an incredible thing. However, it's certainly not my strength. I mean, because of the interconnections in this book, I did have to be quite careful. I had a large spreadsheet with all the ages of the characters at different years and what world events were happening at different times, and that this story happened here, so this could not yet have happened in the life of another person. But extrapolating that over a complex plot involving many books is just absolutely beyond me. So I think people just come at things in the way that they're interested in. And I never really thought about how this book would be plotted. And fortunately, because it's stories, it doesn't really have to be plotted in that way. I just write a chunk of words one day, and then I go over it the next day and kind of fool around with the sentences. And that's really the part that I like. And then I just move on to the next bit. And then in that way, eventually one has a book.
Excellent. I'd like to ask your opinion on something on that, if I may. So I sometimes teach writing classes for amateur writers or people getting into it, or people who just need deadlines and to get through their work and stuff like that.
Sure.
I'm a big structuralist. I focus a lot on structure, and someone asked once about lit fiction, like how does X book or Y book or something fit into the structure? And sometimes they do, you know what I mean? Sometimes it's just, okay, you got to look hard, you know what I mean? Like, and I flippantly say that most of Western books fit into this structure. It's just how hard do you have to squint, you know what I mean, to make it so. But there are some books that I struggled with, and I finally likened to one-act plays. So like if the main structure that I teach is a 3-act structure, a lot of the books that I read from, like Blue Moth Motel, just finished. I was talking about this with Olivia, the author. That's a book that is it's akin to a 1-act play kind of thing. It's a 1-act story, even though it's an entire novel. It's the 3rd act of this person's life, or sometimes it's the 1st act or something like that, or the 2nd act, but it's not the whole thing. It focuses again in that kind of micro level, instead of doing the whole 3 acts, alludes to the rest and focuses in on one. Do you find that short fiction does that best, where it's like it focuses in instead of like, okay, here's the entire story, we're not going to deal with that right now, we're going to zoom in and do this one part of the story?
The Blue Moth Motel is an absolutely gorgeous
novel.
Oh,
I loved it.
And I think it does really well at handling the shifts in time, where although the present is the kind of now of the main character's life, the past is what takes up most of the book.
Yeah, for sure.
So it's kind of the movement toward the present, in which the present is interspersed through the past.
Yeah.
And I really love the sense of magic there. It's not exactly a magic realist book, I would say. It's more realist than magic realist, but there's certainly a sense of kind of intangible beauty and something being transmitted, something ethereal, or being transmitted through the generations.
Yeah, it's something like the you're right, I wouldn't call it magical realism, but it's like the magic of nostalgia, you know what I mean? Like the way that nostalgia can seem magical. I grew up in a very, very, very small town, Francois, Newfoundland, which is one of the last surviving outports. And it reminded me a lot of that, even though it's set in PEI and it's about all the flashbacks are to PEI, that kind of like magical, did that really happen sense of memory kind of thing. When I think back to those places, that's
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
I'd love to go to Francois. It looks so beautiful. I've seen lots of photos. It's on my to-do list. Yeah.
You should, and everyone should, but I say that especially lately. I didn't even realize, but it got put down. But last month, I got a news release that there was an attempt to resettle it. It got voted down,
Really?
but yeah, which I was like, why didn't I hear about this before the vote? I would have had something to say. Like, how much work did you do to bury this, guys? Like,
wow.
Yeah, but thankfully it got voted down. Yeah. Yeah, no, I love Francois. Wonderful. Yeah. Everything coming out of Breakwater lately has been incredible. Breakwater is always incredible, but I should mention that you currently work for Breakwater. But yeah, it's that's why we're on this conversation. But yeah, that's why the conversation is skewed this way, I should say. But
well, I would like to point out that at the time that I submitted the manuscript for my collection of stories, I had no idea that I was going to end up working at Breakwater. It was just fortuitous and happened over time.
Oh yeah, no, that's not what I was implying at all. Yeah,
I know, but I do like to make that point.
Yeah, for sure. That is valid. I also do that sometimes. Everything coming out of Breakwater lately is beautiful. It's always been, but it's the literary press here locally. It's wonderful.
Great writing happening in the province for sure.
Oh yeah. A lot of diversity happening in the province, which is good. Like a lot of diversity of author and a lot of diversity of writing. And there's we're in an interesting age in the province in the last few years that I'm interested to see how we'll look back on it. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Fun. Claire Wilkshire, what is the most difficult part of your artistic process?
Structure.
Really? Why do you find that difficult?
Very challenging. I don't write with a plan. I don't know what's going to happen next. So it just sort of, I find it's like my PhD thesis. I would look at the page and think, what else can I possibly say on the next page after this one, which is the last page that I wrote? So only is more fun than writing a PhD thesis. Otherwise I would be doing it. But so having to look at that retrospectively and think, how can this, I mean, it wasn't so bad for the short stories, but some of them are quite long. One of them is over 10,000 words, so that's sometimes considered a novella. Yep. Having to impose that on my novel Maxine, which came out in 2013, was extremely difficult to try and make a plot that had some sort of forward movement. I find that very challenging.
Okay. Interesting. Okay. Claire Wilkshire, if you didn't write, what would you do for art? What would you do to express yourself? Were you not a writer?
Music, absolutely. I conduct the French choir in town, La Rose des Vents, which is as far as I know, it's still the only adult Francophone choir in the province.
Wow.
And it's just a fantastic thing to be doing. You get to stand up in front of a group of people and move your hands around and they sing. And it's just the most exciting thing ever. I love my singers and I love the French music that we do because there's so much great French music. And if life, if you had 5 lifetimes, I would go back and do a music degree and be a full-time choral conductor to the extent that kind of thing is possible.
That sounds,
in addition to the other full-time jobs I'd like to be doing.
That sounds beautiful and lovely. I'm gonna add going to one of those shows on the things I want to do once pandemic times are over, if they ever are. Can I ask a very, very silly question as someone who knows literally nothing about music? I come from a musical family. Everyone in my family does music except me. When a conductor points at something, when you gesture towards one area or one singer or whatever, what is that singer supposed to do? Are they just supposed to be like, yeah, man? Like, are they supposed to give you the finger guns back? Does that mean go louder? Does that mean go softer?
Well, ideally, you don't point at individuals because it makes them uncomfortable and it's rude.
That's fair.
But what you do is you gesture toward a group of singers. There might be the whole choir, or it might be a subsection of them that are starting at a particular moment. So, in a hymn, for example, everybody else starts pretty much in the same place and they end up in the same place. But in other pieces, you might have the sopranos starting in a certain spot and then the altos might come in a couple of measures later. So when you gesture towards the group, you're saying, hey, altos, here you go. It's your turn to come in now. So that's one reason for gesturing toward a group of people. And
so it's almost like, okay, they know that they're going to start on your beat kind of thing. So they're all starting the same time. We're doing the same thing. And you're going bam, and then going, no, louder. Right. Okay.
Right. And ideally, you don't make a mistake and get it wrong, because it's possible to bring them in by mistake on the wrong beat. And then some of them will follow you and come in on the wrong beat. And then others who are paying close attention will know where they're supposed to come in and come in where they're supposed to. And that can all, so, you try to figure out how not to make mistakes, especially in performance, but that can still happen.
Interesting. Are there specific, like in the industry, like gestures like that are used kind of like sign language, but in this particular thing, or is it specific to each group and conductor?
There are lots of conventions that many people will use. So there are certain ways of beating a 3-beat pattern or a 4-beat pattern or what have you, and you do that with your right hand, and then with your left hand, that's supposed to be your expressive hand. So you'll use that to show when it's getting louder or softer. Usually, if it's supposed to be louder, you make bigger gestures, and if it's supposed to be softer, you make smaller gestures. And so there's a whole series of conventions. And when it's time for people to stop singing, there are different ways to cut them off. You can make a little circle with your index finger and your thumb, or you can just sort of turn your palms down and give your hands a little bounce to say, yep, that's the end of that bit, or different things. But there's certainly there's a sort of language of conducting, so that if the conductor goes to another choir, it wouldn't be very good if everybody had their own set of gestures, because then if you go to another choir, nobody would know what you were doing. So
I was watching a lecture on gesture recently, and like literally that part of communication, like that. This is actually part of why I record this with video on, because I talk with my hands a lot, and a lot of people do. But they've done studies on gesture, and even people who are blind from birth have some form of gesture in their speech. Gesture is just an innate part of communication that gets ignored. Yeah.
Fascinating. That's why when you're learning another language, it's terrifying to have to make a phone call in that language, because you don't get the facial expression. You're relying only on your imperfect knowledge of the words to communicate.
Yes. Wow, I never even thought about that. When I was discussing with one of the Us Now writers, I seem to be incapable of learning another language. I learned sign language, which I was very happy with, and I took to it very quickly. But there's something wrong with my brain, I swear. If I learned that I was dropped as a child and am incapable of learning new language as a result, I would absolutely believe it.
I bet sign language shows that you have a specific capacity to do things that involve that connection between kind of innate language and motor skills and that kind of thing. That sounds more complicated to me in lots of ways.
Well, thank you, Claire Wilkshire, for coming on the Right Project podcast. As always, you can pick up the Love Olympics wherever fine books are sold in this province, and please do. It is definitely worth it for your time. It makes a great bedside read, very much like the much better version of the Chicken Soup books. It is a lovely book of short stories that will make you feel good and warm and fuzzy and lovely. Thank you for coming on, Claire.
Thank you so much for having me, Matthew.
Wonderful, wonderful.